There's a unique kind of power that a super empath carries, quiet, steady, and deeply self-assured. It's not loud. It's not explosive. It doesn't even need to announce itself. And yet, when this power meets someone with avoidant tendencies, something remarkable happens. The avoidant, who once believed they held all the control, begins to feel their ego unravel in the most unexpected way. Not through drama, not through confrontation, but through the super empath silence. See, the avoidant operates on distance. They protect themselves by disconnecting, by pulling away, by pretending not to care. And for a while it works. They convince themselves they're untouchable. But a super empath is not someone who chases, begs, or tries to convince someone to see their worth. Instead, they quietly reclaim their emotional real estate. They shift their focus inward. They stop participating in the avoidance push-pull cycle. And that is what truly shakes the avoidant to the core. Because when a super empath withdraws, it's not to punish, it's to protect. When they stop explaining themselves, stop defending, stop trying to decode mixed signals, that silence sends a message louder than anything words could craft. A message the avoidant never expected. I'm not here to be controlled, confused, or minimized. I know my value, and I won't spend my life proving it to someone who can't see it. And suddenly, the avoidant's confidence starts to slip. Their usual patterns stop working. Their sense of superiority cracks. The person they thought they could keep at arm's length is no longer waiting at that distance. They're walking away. And that loss of control, that's the real ego breaker. A super empath doesn't destroy an avoidant's ego with anger. They don't attack, belittle, or manipulate. They simply choose themselves. They choose peace over chaos, clarity over uncertainty, self-respect over emotional guessing games. And in doing so, they reveal the truth the avoidant avoided for so long. You were never the weak one for caring. They were simply too afraid to receive it. When the avoidant finally realizes what they've lost, not just a partner, but a healer, a listener, a mirror, that's when their ego truly collapses. Not because the super empath punished them, but because they removed access to the very thing that made the avoidant feel safe from a distance. Unconditional emotional availability. And that is the quiet revolution of the super empath. They don't break others. They break cycles. They don't destroy egos. They expose truth. They don't shout. They evolve. And in that evolution, the avoidant is left to face the one thing they've been running from all along, themselves. When a super empath goes silent, it isn't a reaction born from anger or frustration. It's a conscious shift in emotional power. For so long, the avoidant relied on an unspoken expectation that the empath would always be there, always available, always willing to bridge the emotional gap that the avoidant created. The empath's heart, their patience, and their openness became the safety net the avoidant never acknowledged but deeply depended on. And that is exactly why the empath's silence is so powerful. It removes the safety net. It forces the avoidant to feel the emotional space they once controlled. Suddenly, the quiet is louder than any confrontation could ever be. The avoidant expects conflict, arguments, emotional pleas, or attempts at closeness, because those reactions allow them to retreat further into their defensive distance. They know how to resist pressure. They know how to evade emotional demands. But what they don't know how to handle is the absence of reaction. Silence confuses them because it shifts the dynamic in a way they never anticipated. When the super empath stops explaining their feelings, stops asking for reassurance, and stops trying to repair what the avoidant keeps breaking, the avoidant loses the emotional script they were used to. There's no chase, no tension, no validation to manipulate. And that's when the avoidant's ego begins to crack. Silence exposes the truth that the avoidant tried to avoid. They were never in control. They simply relied on the empath's willingness to overextend themselves emotionally. Without that effort, the avoidant can't maintain their illusion of superiority or emotional detachment. The silence forces them into a position they've spent their entire life avoiding, reflection. They start wondering if they've pushed too far, if they've underestimated the empath, or if they've lost something that won't return. That internal anxiety bruises their ego in a way that confrontations never could, because it comes from within, not from the empath's words. A super empath's silence is also a powerful mirror. It reflects the avoidant's behavior back onto them with stunning clarity. Suddenly, the avoidant experiences the same distance they used as protection, and it doesn't feel protective anymore. It feels isolating. They start noticing the absence of messages, calls, emotional warmth, and presence. What they once dismissed now feels like a void, and that void is a direct result of their own actions. This realization is uncomfortable, often deeply painful, because it undermines their belief that emotional distance keeps them safe from vulnerability. Instead, they face the truth that distance only protects them when the other person is still emotionally invested. When that investment fades, distance becomes a prison. The empath's silence also signals something the avoidant never wanted to confront. The empath is no longer prioritizing their emotional needs. This hits the avoidant's ego because it challenges their assumption that the empath would always be there, unconditionally. The silence says, "I'm done playing this game," without ever needing the words. It communicates boundaries, strength, and self-respect in a way that demands attention. The avoidant may try to convince themselves they don't care, but the truth is, silence forces them to feel the emotional consequences of their own behavior. And that impact is far more devastating to the ego than any argument, accusation, or emotional outburst ever could be. The power of a super empath's silence lies in its clarity. It isn't a weapon, it's a withdrawal of energy. It removes the emotional oxygen the avoidant fed on. It refuses to participate in the cycle of push and pull. And in this absence, the avoidant is confronted with something they never expected, the awareness that they may have lost the very person who understood them the most. Avoidants build their emotional world around one central belief: distance keeps them safe. It's their shield, their comfort zone, their default response when intimacy feels too close or too real. For a long time, this strategy works because the partner, especially a super empath, naturally fills the emotional gaps. The empath intuitively steps forward, bridges the silence, softens the tension, and provides reassurance without being asked. This dynamic allows the avoidant to maintain the illusion of control. They believe that their distancing tactics are effective, that pulling back protects them while still keeping the empath close enough to return whenever they feel ready. But the moment the super empath stops reacting to these patterns, everything changes. When the empath no longer responds with hurt, confusion, or attempts to reconnect, the avoidant loses the psychological leverage they once depended on. The silence of the empath becomes a disruption in the avoidant's familiar emotional cycle. Suddenly, the predictable rhythm of push and pull is gone. The avoidant pulls back and nothing happens. They send mixed signals and the empath doesn't chase. They withdraw emotionally and the empath doesn't try to decode or correct the distance. The avoidance strategy, once so effective, suddenly stops working. And this is where the internal unraveling begins. Avoidants expect emotional reactions from others because reactions confirm their sense of importance and control. Even negative reactions, frustration, tears, questions, reassure them that the other person is still attached. But when the super empath no longer reacts, the avoidant is forced to confront a truth they never prepared for. Their behavior no longer influences the empath. The empath's emotional detachment disrupts the avoidant's sense of security, revealing that the power was never in the avoidant's distance, but in the empath's willingness to stay connected despite it. The avoidant begins to feel something unfamiliar, uncertainty. They start analyzing the shift, wondering why their usual methods aren't creating the same responses. This uncertainty quickly morphs into discomfort, then anxiety. They may try subtle tests, short messages, small gestures, vague hints, to see if the empath is still emotionally available. But when the empath continues to remain calm, composed, and unaffected, the avoidant's ego takes a hit. It signals to them that the empath may no longer be emotionally dependent, and this loss of influence is deeply destabilizing. This loss of control challenges everything the avoidant believed about the bond. They once assumed the empath's loyalty was fixed, unshakable, and guaranteed. The empath's emotional investment made it easy for the avoidant to maintain distance without fear of abandonment. But now, as the avoidant realizes that the empath's emotional availability is not endless, their inner world begins to wobble. What they used to interpret as safety, emotional distance, suddenly feels like isolation. The space they created for self-protection becomes a silent reminder of everything they might be losing. Avoidants often rely on emotional ambiguity to maintain control. But ambiguity loses its power when the other person no longer plays along. The super empath's calm detachment creates a new dynamic where clarity replaces confusion. The empath is no longer seeking reassurance, no longer trying to mend the emotional gap, no longer waiting for the avoidant to come around. This shift forces the avoidant to sit with the discomfort of their own patterns. With no emotional shield, no buffer, and no chase to soothe their ego, the avoidant begins to feel the weight of consequences they never expected. They may start to compare the empath's old behavior with the new one, realizing how much emotional effort was once given freely. This realization often leads to a quiet panic, not because they fear losing the relationship in a traditional sense, but because they fear losing the emotional power dynamic they relied on. Their distancing no longer creates longing, it creates indifference. Their silence no longer creates tension, it creates peace on the empath's side. And in this shifted landscape, the avoidant experiences what they've unconsciously feared the most, losing someone not because of a fight, but because the person simply stopped participating in the cycle. When a super empath reaches the point of choosing self-worth over the relationship, something profound shifts beneath the surface. For so long, they have been the emotional anchor, the one who understands, supports, reassures, and fills the gaps left by the avoidant's distance. They try to hold space for the avoidant's fears, insecurities, and emotional walls, often sacrificing their own needs to keep the connection alive. But eventually, the weight of carrying the relationship alone becomes too heavy. The empath realizes that love without reciprocity isn't love, it's self-abandonment. And in that moment of clarity, they begin to choose themselves. That single choice sends a shockwave through the avoidant's ego. Choosing self-worth doesn't require the empath to make a dramatic exit. It doesn't require confrontation, accusations, or ultimatums. It happens quietly. The empath begins to pull their energy back into themselves. They stop over-explaining. They stop accepting crumbs. They stop prioritizing the avoidant's comfort over their own emotional health. The avoidant, who once relied on the empath's unconditional availability, suddenly feels the difference. They sense the shift even if they can't articulate it. The empath no longer responds instantly. They no longer attempt to soothe the avoidant's withdrawn moods. They no longer bend their boundaries to keep the peace. These small but powerful changes create a ripple effect that the avoidant cannot avoid. What hits the avoidant hardest is not the idea of losing the relationship. It's the realization that the empath is no longer emotionally dependent on them. The avoidant's ego is built around the belief that they are the prize that someone will always wait for, always tolerate, always forgive. They subconsciously assume that the empath's love is endless and therefore safe to take for granted. When the empath stops operating from a place of emotional scarcity and instead embraces self-worth, the avoidant loses their sense of superiority. The dynamic they once controlled begins to crumble. Super empaths have a unique ability to see potential in people. They see the fear behind the avoidance distance, the hurt behind their defensiveness, the longing behind their emotional withdrawal. This compassion becomes both a gift and a burden. But when the empath finally understands that potential cannot replace reality, they shift from effort to acceptance. They stop trying to heal someone who refuses to heal themselves. They stop trying to be enough for someone who doesn't even meet them halfway. This acceptance is what truly dismantles the avoidance ego, because it shows that the empath is no longer willing to sacrifice self-love to maintain connection. The avoidance identity often revolves around the idea that others will try to win their affection. They rely on emotional inconsistencies to maintain a sense of control. But when the empath steps out of that dynamic, the avoidant can no longer deny the truth. The person they thought would always be there is choosing themselves instead. This realization taps directly into the avoidant's hidden fear of not being worthy of love. The empath's self-worth exposes the avoidant's self-doubt. What makes this shift so devastating to the avoidant's ego is that it cannot be blamed on drama or conflict. The empath didn't attack, guilt trip, or push them away. Instead, they simply honored themselves. And there is nothing the avoidant can argue with because self-respect is not confrontational. It is undeniable. The avoidant is left face to face with the consequence of their own emotional avoidance. Someone who once loved them deeply now finds peace in letting go. When the super empath chooses self-worth, they aren't trying to hurt the avoidant. They are simply reclaiming their value. And in doing so, they illuminate the truth the avoidant has been escaping for years, that real love cannot be sustained through distance, fear, and inconsistency. It can only survive where there is reciprocity. Once the empath understands this, their energy shifts, and that shift becomes the quiet undoing of the avoidant's ego. A super empath has a way of revealing truth without ever having to force it. Their presence alone encourages openness, healing, and vulnerability, even in people who are terrified of emotional closeness. This is why avoidants are often drawn to them. They feel seen without being judged, understood without having to explain themselves, and cared for without pressure. But when the dynamic becomes unbalanced and the avoidant continually withdraws, dismisses emotional needs, or refuses to engage in genuine connection, the empath naturally begins to step back. And it's this gentle retreat, not an argument or accusation, that exposes the avoidant's deepest fears. Unlike confrontation, which avoidants are prepared for, the empath's calm absence triggers something far more uncomfortable: self-awareness. Avoidants dislike introspection because it forces them to acknowledge the emotional wounds they've tried to outrun for years. Yet the empath's silence, emotional neutrality, and refusal to chase creates a powerful mirror. Suddenly, the avoidant is left alone with the consequences of their own choices. There is no one soothing their insecurities, no one absorbing their emotional distance, and no one bridging the gaps they created. They have to face the feelings they buried beneath avoidance: fear of vulnerability, fear of inadequacy, fear of truly being seen. The empath never sets out to expose these fears. They don't manipulate, punish, or shame. They simply stop compensating for the avoidance behavior. In that stillness, a new clarity emerges. The avoidant begins to recognize how much effort the empath actually provided in the relationship. Effort that was easy to overlook when it was constant. They start noticing the absence of emotional support, understanding, and warmth, and in that noticing, their patterns become unmistakable. The avoidant sees the emotional walls they built not as shields, but as barriers that kept them from true connection. This revelation is deeply uncomfortable for the avoidant because it dismantles the narrative they've been telling themselves. They often believe they are self-sufficient, unaffected by emotional closeness, and in control of their feelings. But once the empath steps away, the avoidant feels a strange emptiness, a void where reassurance, connection, and consistency used to be. And that void isn't about losing the empath's love. It's about losing the emotional stability the empath quietly provided. The avoidant is forced to see that their emotional detachment didn't protect them, it isolated them. The empath's absence also exposes the avoidant's hidden emotional dependency. Avoidants often pretend they don't need reassurance or closeness, but they rely heavily on the other person's availability to feel secure from a distance. When that availability disappears, their ego is confronted with the truth: they were never as independent or unaffected as they believed. The empath's silence reveals the emotional attachment the avoidant denied having. Suddenly, the avoidant realizes they cared more than they admitted, and that admission shakes them. This internal disruption often triggers a defensive reaction. Avoidants may convince themselves they don't care, attempt to distract themselves, or even seek temporary validation elsewhere. But the void remains, and so does the awareness that their behavior contributed to losing someone who offered emotional safety. The empath's withdrawal forces the avoidant to acknowledge their role in the breakdown, not because the empath demanded accountability, but because their absence highlights everything the avoidant avoided addressing. In the end, the empath's silence isn't an attack, it's a reflection. It shows the avoidant the very pain they once projected onto others. It reveals how their patterns push away the very connection they crave, and it quietly, powerfully dismantles the avoidant's ego by making them face the truth they've spent a lifetime avoiding. Emotional distance is not strength, it is fear. A super empath operates from a place of deep emotional awareness. They feel everything intensely, understand people effortlessly, and carry a natural desire to heal rather than hurt. This is what makes them so different in relationships, especially with avoidance. They don't seek power, control, or dominance. They seek connection, understanding, and emotional truth. And because of this, when a super empath steps back or begins to prioritize their own well-being, they don't break people. They break the unhealthy cycles that people have been stuck in for years. This distinction is what makes their impact so profound. Avoidants often get trapped in repetitive emotional patterns, push away, retreat, distance, come back, repeat. They've lived inside this loop for so long that it becomes their identity. They believe it's normal. They believe it's the only way to protect themselves from vulnerability or disappointment. But when they meet a super empath, the dynamic changes. The empath doesn't respond to emotional distance with anger. They respond with understanding. They don't fight the avoidance withdrawal. They try to meet them where they are. They don't shame or pressure them. They create emotional safety. This disrupts the avoidance usual cycle in a way they aren't prepared for. But the real transformation happens when the empath chooses not to carry the emotional weight alone. When they stop absorbing the avoidance fears, stop excusing their inconsistency, and stop sacrificing their own needs for the sake of the connection, the cycle the avoidant relies on begins to collapse. The avoidant can no longer run from intimacy while still benefiting from closeness. They can no longer withdraw while expecting the empath to stay. The empath's growth forces the avoidant to pause and confront the reality of the dynamic they've created. This is not destruction, it's evolution. The empath refuses to enable the avoidant's emotional avoidance. They remove themselves from the cycle of chasing, fixing, and compensating, and in doing so, they set a boundary the avoidant has likely never experienced. I love you, but I will not betray myself to stay connected to you. That boundary is not a punishment, it's a shift toward emotional balance. And for the avoidant, this new balance is unsettling because it exposes the dysfunction they've previously disguised as self-protection. Super empaths have an extraordinary ability to shine light on the emotional truths no one else dares to articulate. When they step back, it highlights the avoidance patterns with undeniable clarity. It reveals how the avoidant has been operating on autopilot, holding others at arm's length while longing for connection they're too afraid to receive. It reveals how the avoidant mistakes vulnerability for danger, when in reality, vulnerability is the only pathway to intimacy. The empath doesn't point these things out through criticism. They reveal them through their absence, through their boundaries, through their refusal to participate in emotional chaos. What ultimately shatters the avoidance ego is not that the empath walked away. It's that the empath walked away without anger. They didn't try to change the avoidant. They didn't beg. They didn't fight. They simply recognized the cycle, stepped out of it, and allowed the avoidant to face themselves without interference. This kind of clarity is powerful. It forces the avoidant to confront the truth they've avoided their entire life. Emotional distance doesn't prevent pain. It creates it. And this is why super empaths don't break people. They don't set out to damage or diminish anyone. What they break are the patterns of emotional dysfunction that keep both partners stuck. Their decision to choose self-respect over self-sacrifice inspires change, reflection, and growth. And in the wake of their silence, the avoidant is left with the realization that the cycle can only continue if someone is willing to participate. The empath's refusal to continue becomes the catalyst for the avoidant's deepest awakening. And so, as we close this journey into the quiet power of the super empath, remember that true strength isn't found in fighting, forcing, or fixing. It's found in choosing yourself with grace, clarity, and courage. When an empath steps out of old patterns, they don't just free themselves, they create space for truth, healing, and transformation, even for the avoidant who never expected to face their own reflection. Thank you for listening, for reflecting, and for valuing your emotional growth. Your presence here shows a commitment to understanding relationships on a deeper level, and I appreciate you for taking this step toward your own empowerment.